In 2018, if you wanted to know where the world's factories were, there was one answer: China. Today, ask that question again, and the answer is starting to change. Samsung now makes more phones in Vietnam than anywhere else on Earth. Apple has moved a growing share of AirPods and iPad production there. Nike, Adidas, and dozens of other household names have quietly shifted a huge portion of manufacturing out of China and into a country roughly the size of New Mexico. So how did Vietnam become one of the most important manufacturing economies on the planet? This is Macro Signal. Today, why Vietnam is becoming the world's new factory. For nearly 3 decades, China was the default choice for manufacturing almost anything. Cheap labor, enormous infrastructure, and a government laser-focused on industrial growth turned it into what people started calling the world's factory. That started to change for 3 reasons. First, wages. Chinese manufacturing wages have risen roughly 5-fold since 2005, and companies chasing low costs began looking elsewhere. Second, the 2018 U.S.-China trade war added tariffs of up to 25% on many Chinese exports, making made in China suddenly more expensive for American buyers. Third, the pandemic exposed just how risky it is to have your entire supply chain sitting in one country. When China locked down, global supply chains didn't just slow, they broke. Companies needed a plan B, and Vietnam had spent the previous decade quietly building exactly the kind of infrastructure and trade relationships that Plan B required. Vietnam shares a land border with China, which matters more than it sounds. Companies can shift final assembly across that border without rebuilding an entire supply chain from scratch. Many factories in Vietnam still import Chinese components and simply finish the product locally, sidestepping tariffs while keeping the rest of the network intact. Geography alone gave Vietnam a head start that competitors further away couldn't match. Vietnam didn't win this by accident. 3 things set it apart from other low-cost countries competing for the same investment. First, geography, which we just covered. Second, trade agreements. Vietnam is part of more free trade agreements than almost any country its size, including the CPTPP and a trade deal with the European Union, giving companies that manufacture there preferential access to markets that would otherwise charge steep tariffs. Third, government policy. Vietnam's government has spent 2 decades treating export manufacturing as a national priority, building deep water ports, industrial zones, and offering long tax holidays to foreign manufacturers willing to set up shop. The result, foreign direct investment into Vietnam has more than tripled over the past decade. Look at the money flowing in. Foreign direct investment climbed steadily through the 2000s and then accelerated sharply after 2018, exactly when the trade war began, and again after 2020, when the pandemic broke confidence in single-country supply chains for good. But Vietnam is not simply becoming a smaller version of China, and it likely can't. Its population is about 100 million people, compared to China's 1.4 billion. There's a hard ceiling on how much manufacturing capacity it can absorb. Its infrastructure, while improving fast, still struggles with the scale China built over 30 years. Ports get congested, and power shortages have already forced factory shutdowns in peak seasons. There's also a skill ceiling. China moved up the value chain over decades, from basic assembly to advanced electronics and precision manufacturing. Vietnam is still largely doing the assembly work. The highest value components often still get made in China, Korea, or Japan, and simply get put together in Vietnam. That's a real economy, but it's not yet the same tier of economy. Here's the signal check. 1. Vietnam's rise isn't happening instead of China's manufacturing dominance, it's happening alongside it, as companies diversify rather than relocate entirely. 2. Geography and trade agreements, not just cheap labor, are what actually won Vietnam this investment, which is why it's hard for other low-cost countries to simply copy the strategy. 3. The real test for Vietnam's economy isn't whether it can keep attracting factories, it's whether it can move up to higher value manufacturing before the next low-cost country starts competing for the same investment. If you want to understand the next economy going through this same shift, subscribe. The next macro signal breakdown is coming soon.